Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It's just about 10 weeks to go until the election. 2 weeks to go until we're supposed to see a presidential debate take place on ABC. That's on September 10th. And of course, these weeks are sure to fly by because just to give you a sense of how quickly time is moving in this election cycle, it was 5 weeks ago that Joe Biden dropped his re-election bid, exiting the presidential race, making way for Kamala Harris, who within those last 5 weeks, her campaign says, has now raised over $500 million, $540 million to be exact, raised by her campaign and affiliated super PACs. 82 million of that was raised at the DNC in Chicago last week. So it is a money race here that we are paying attention to, and always with an eye on it is Bloomberg's Gregory Korte, who covers the White House and politics for us and is joining me now in studio here in Washington. So Gregory, of course, cash advantage is a big thing in the presidential campaign. We've seen Biden during the course of his now ended campaign, outraising Trump, then Trump outraising Biden. It does feel like things have flip-flopped a lot. But with the kind of frenetic pace of fundraising we have seen so far from the Harris campaign, is it going to be possible for Donald Trump to reach a cash advantage once again?
Yeah, I'm glad you set up that context, because that's exactly what I was going to bring to this. So the question that you asked now, where do we go from here? And I think that's an open question. Look, both of these campaigns, it's part of the modern political presidential campaign game to seize on a moment. And one way to quantify how big a moment is to talk about your small dollar fundraising. So when Trump was leading in the fundraising, it was because he was being indicted or convicted, and people rallied around him. President Biden had a big fundraising a week after his State of the Union address. And here we have Kamala Harris being the new fresh face in this race, right? She enters the race. She gets a bounce. She continues to get that bounce through the convention. As you said, more than $500 million in just 1 month. I mean, let's just wrap our heads around how astronomical that is. A few months ago, if a candidate had, 100 million, 150 million, we would think of that as a big month. So this is huge. And what the Harris campaign would point to is the first-time donors, because those donors suggest room to grow. They're not at the $3,300 person limit, presumably. These are often $50, so maybe they'll give $50 again next month and again. And so these are encouraging numbers for the Harris campaign. The question is, can Trump find some moment for him to rally around? And it could be the debate. It could be some other moment, some October surprise that we haven't quite, we don't know yet. But that's certainly going to be the game for both these candidates.
Well, I'm glad you point out that the campaign did emphasize that about a third of these donors of the $540 million were first timers. They also said 2/3 were women, Gregory. And I wonder how telling that is when we've been talking about the battle for women, specifically in the suburbs, and how pivotal they could be in ultimately deciding which way this election goes.
That is remarkable. I've been doing this long enough that a few decades ago, when you would see a campaign contribution, it would often be done in the husband's name, but they would both of them would contribute as sort of a household. Now we're seeing women donate in their own names. And very often you might see the husband donating to one party and the wife donating to the other party and canceling each other out. It is remarkable, and it demonstrates how big this gender gap is growing. Even before Kamala Harris got into the race, we were seeing a growing divide between men and women in America that has been growing for decades, but really Donald Trump has accelerated it. Now Kamala Harris is in the race and obviously talking about a lot of women's issues. She's talking about reproductive rights, but she's also talking about childcare. She's talking about things that will appeal to that holy grail of swing voter, the suburban woman.
Well, and of course, she's not just talking about it on stage, as we saw her do in Chicago or in her various campaign appearances. She's also taking a lot of that messaging to the airwaves, which raises the question, Gregory, about it's one thing to raise all the money. It's another thing to spend it. And the pace of spending matters here as well, right? We have seen this campaign and Biden's campaign before this shelling out more cash than Donald Trump's was. or is now.
Yeah, and the feeling when it was Biden spending that money is that he needed to make up some ground, and soon. He left Kamala Harris with about a $92 million war chest. She's obviously built and expanded upon that. But the candidate dollars, for as much as we talk about super PACs, the candidate dollars are so valuable because under Federal Election Commission and Federal Communication Commission rules, the TV stations have to give the lowest, best deal to the candidate campaigns. They get the time blocked off for them first. And so those dollars go a lot further. Super PACs can do a lot in terms of filling in the gaps, but it's really these campaign dollars that go the furthest. What we are going to see, though, in a lot of these swing states, especially Pennsylvania, where the lion's share of the money is being spent right now, is you might get to the part where there's just no ad inventory on broadcast stations to buy.
It's all bought up.
If you're a mattress store or a car dealer in Pennsylvania, you may just take the month of October off because you may not be able to buy an ad. The airwaves are going to be so saturated with political ads. I'm already hearing it. I stopped by the Pennsylvania delegation at the Democratic Convention last week, and they are already just inundated back to back ads.
Well, on the subject of ads, it calls to mind during the Super Bowl, we saw a few political ads as well. One of them that perhaps got the most attention was from RFK Jr., a campaign that now is put on pause. He dropped out, or not, I guess, officially dropped out, but suspended his campaign on Friday, endorsed former President Trump. Do we have a sense yet of what real difference that's likely to make? Where the people who were suggesting in polls were going to vote for him go now?
There's a Republican answer to this question. There's a Democratic answer to this question. I'll give you my answer to this question.
That's the one I want.
Which is that I don't know that it makes a whole lot of difference. What we saw before he dropped out was that he was taking roughly equally from Republicans and Democrats. The Republicans will point to some numbers that he was taking a little bit more from Trump, maybe, and so this advantages him, but that was all within the margin of error. But also keep in mind that a good number of Kennedy supporters, maybe 40%, were people who said they wouldn't show up to vote if it were just Trump versus Harris. These were a lot of double haters, and they were double haters for a reason. So the big question is going to be, just because RFK endorses Trump, will his followers go with him to Trump? And that's something we're just going to have to watch in the polls for the next few weeks. But keep in mind, Kennedy had started with he topped out at maybe 15%. Some polls had him as high as 20%. By the time he dropped out, he was under 5%. So we're not talking about a huge voting block. In some of these swing states, it could make a difference. And that's why I think he made the decision he did.
All right, Bloomberg White House and politics reporter Gregory Korte, thank you as always for joining me. Now, to continue this conversation, we turn to Matt Bennett. He is executive vice president at Third Way. Matt, of course, we caught up in Chicago briefly as well, and I asked you about RFK Jr. at that time on the eve of his suspension of his campaign. He now, of course, has done so, and I wonder if your answer agrees with Gregory's, that it's not actually clear this is going to make much difference at all.
Yeah, I fundamentally agree with that. However, I will give you the Democratic answer. As Gregory noted, there are two. And that is, what we really don't know is the scale of this. RFK could be a problem for Trump for two reasons. First, he is kind of repellent to a lot of women. He has admitted to sexually assaulting his kid's babysitter and has said there's probably other women out there that are come forward with allegations against him that he admits. And the second thing is he said he would sign a federal abortion ban when he was still running for president. So those are not things designed to attract women. Also, the guy is just super weird. I mean, over the weekend, a story came out about how he took his kids down to the beach, cut the head off a beached whale, put it on the roof of his car, and had his kids put plastic bags on their heads to keep the whale juice off of their heads. I mean, he is a weirdo. And if Trump and Vance are trying to avoid that label, maybe bringing RFK on wasn't such a great idea.
Okay, so now we have the whale story, we have the bear story, we have the photo next to a barbecued dog at one point many years ago, Matt, all of these animal reminders. It is worth pointing out, of course, that you at Third Way also played a role in vanquishing, if you will, no labels, or at least their efforts this election cycle, out of concern that they could actually be a big spoiler. There was the spoiler concern about RFK Jr. as well, and arguably, if you listen to him and his running mate, Nicole Shanahan, it was the idea that they were turning into a spoiler that impacted their decision here. What does it say to you that now there is really no third party option, that this is ultimately going to be a choice, Trump, Harris, or stay home for the American voter?
Well, first of all, we're very happy that the major third-party candidates, No Labels and RFK, are now out of the race. I think it makes it much clearer for voters. However, there are a couple left. Jill Stein is still running as a Green Party candidate. That might not strike most listeners as very important, but she had an impact on the outcome of the election in 2016, even getting only 1 or 2% of the vote in swing states. If she does that again, that could matter. So we're going to keep the pressure on and make sure that voters understand who Jill Stein is and that she's not a safe place for them to park their vote if they're unhappy with both Harris and Trump.
As we consider where votes move when candidates leave the race, it does take me back to the conversation we were having in March after Super Tuesday when Nikki Haley dropped out. This idea, where does the Nikki Haley voter go? Now that we are seeing Harris pick up in polls, in some cases substantially higher than Joe Biden was polling in July when he dropped out of the race, does that suggest to you that maybe some of those Nikki Haley voters are indeed going to her as that other choice, or do we not know that answer definitively yet?
Well, there certainly are some. I mean, we saw them at the convention in T-shirts that said Haley voter for Harris. So we just don't know the magnitude of that. My guess is that most of the reason that the polls have tightened is because the people that we refer to as the double haters, people that were unhappy with both Trump and Biden, have overwhelmingly moved towards Harris. They have gone from something like 22% of the electorate down to below 10. And that can be the reason for the difference. Some of them may have voted for Haley in the primaries, some didn't. But there is a real battle on for those people who may never have voted for a Democrat before, but just can't bring themselves to vote for Trump for all of the reasons that Harris and others have articulated.
So what wins that battle, Matt? Is it money that helps, or is it actual people that helps? And I ask this because as I was just talking to Gregory about the big fundraising haul for Harris in the month and change since Biden dropped out, yes, it's over $500 million, but her campaign also pointed to more than 200,000 people signing up as volunteers. What matters more?
Oh, well, there's no doubt that people matter more than money, especially in presidential races. In modern presidential campaigns, no one loses or wins because they have more money, because both sides have so much that they basically hit a point of diminishing returns in the handful of states that really matter. If you live in Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, you have my condolences. You're in for a hellish several months of television viewing, and they're going to see plenty of ads. What matters most is hearing from trusted messengers. And what that means is mostly people in their networks, people that they know, their neighbors, their colleagues, their friends, their family. And the fact that so many new people are coming to the Harris campaign to volunteer is enormously important. Now, a lot of those 200,000 do not live in those 7 states, and they can be helpful, but not as helpful as the people who do. So we really got to hope that people rally to her in the places that matter the most.
Well, and in those places that matter most, those swing states, we're seeing the candidates crisscrossing them this week. Trump's planning to go to Michigan and Pennsylvania. Harris-Walz later on this week will be doing a bus tour of Georgia, as some polling have suggests, Matt, that the Sun Belt is more in play than it was for Joe Biden. If you were advising the campaign on where they should be divvying up their time, their resources, be it people, money, or otherwise, should they be focusing a lot of energy on the Sun Belt, or should they concentrate in the Rust Belt, where we're seeing Trump and Vance spend a lot of time?
I think they got to do both for a couple of reasons. First of all, unlike when Biden was running, as you note, Harris definitely has a shot in North Carolina, in Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. And winning some or all of those states could be the difference, even if we end up losing one of the blue wall states of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. So I do think they have the resources, they have the surrogates they can send into these places. I think it's a good idea. And remember, when she campaigns in Georgia, that means Trump has to as well. If one campaign ignores a state, the other that is stronger there can do the same. But now we're going to make the Trump people spend money and time in Georgia as well. So I think it's a good investment.
All right, Matt Bennett, Executive Vice President at Third Way. Always great to have you here on Balance of Power. Thank you so much for joining me. That does seem to be part of the strategy for both campaigns. Force them to spend money in places that they may not want to or may not have planned to as substantially. It's going to be something we continue to follow here.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Back in Washington after a marathon week last week in Chicago at the Democratic National Convention. And at that convention, the Democrats focused a lot on this notion of freedom. Freedom when it comes to a number of things, but reproductive rights specifically, something that kept entering the conversation. Remember when Kamala Harris was accepting the Democratic presidential nomination? In her speech, as she was talking about abortion rights, she suggested that Trump and Republicans are, quote, out of their minds when it comes to that issue. The question is whether their minds can actually change. And perhaps the appearance of JD Vance, of course, the Republican vice presidential nominee, on Meet the Press yesterday when he talked about abortion as an indication of that. This is what he had to say.
I can absolutely commit that, Kristen, and Donald Trump has been as clear about that as possible. I think it's important to step back and say, what has Donald Trump actually said on the abortion question, and how is it different from what Kamala Harris and the Democrats have said? Donald Trump wants to end this culture war over this particular topic. If California wants to have a different abortion policy from Ohio, then Ohio has to respect California and California has to respect Ohio. Donald Trump's view is that we want the individual states and their individual cultures and their unique political sensibilities to make these decisions.
Now, what the senator said he could commit to was this notion that Donald Trump would not sign into law a federal abortion ban. Later on in the program on Meet the Press, Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren joined, and she said, quote, American women are not stupid, and we are not going to trust the futures of our daughters and granddaughters to two men who have openly bragged about blocking access to abortion for women all across this country. And it's on this note we assemble our political panel today. Two women, in fact, Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, together today with Republican strategist Brittany Martinez, who, of course, is founder at Espina & Company. Thank you both so much for joining me. Jeanne, I'll come to you first because it is worth pointing out that during the first Trump administration back in 2018, and I'd like to thank my producer Cece for flagging this morning, Donald Trump was encouraging the Senate to pass a 20-week abortion ban so they could send it to his desk for him to sign. Should voters believe that he wouldn't pursue something similar this time around, or should some kind of evolution on this issue be allowed?
Yeah, I think on both sides, we are hearing the sound of everybody desperately trying to run to the center. I mean, at the Democratic convention, we heard the Democrats, Kamala Harris, it was as if she never ran in 2019, moving right to the center. And we see Donald Trump and JD Vance doing this as well. And that's what that interview on Meet the Press was all about. We've seen Donald Trump screaming on Truth Social that women will be safe. I'm great with women. They love me. So they are desperately trying to go to the center because Republicans know on this issue of abortion, regardless of what you think of it personally, electorally, it has been a big problem for Republicans since Roe was overturned. So can you trust him? I think Elizabeth Warren suggested no can do when they've been bragging about it. But the reality is he and Kamala Harris are doing what they have to do electorally to try to show people that they are moderate in the middle and not to worry about things that, you know, their party and they in the past have said and now they are running away from.
So if everybody's rushing to the middle, Brittany, and we include the Republican ticket in that, if Jeanne is to be believed, does that actually risk backfiring? If Donald Trump is rushing toward the middle, or JD Vance is doing so perhaps on his behalf to try to attract more moderates, do they risk alienating what comprises a decent portion of the Republican base, which is pro-life, who already were feeling like the campaign was kind of betraying them in, for example, adopting a policy platform that didn't call explicitly at the RNC for a federal abortion ban? Does this risk backfiring? Is this something that can work?
I mean, I think that's probably always a possibility, but here's what we have to keep in mind. According to Pew Research polling from earlier this year, 63% of Americans think that abortion should be legal in all or in some cases, whereas it's only 36% the other way around. When you break it up by party, obviously Republicans are more conservative on that issue, of course, but also if you look back to earlier this year during the Republican primary, Nikki Haley was our best messenger when it came to abortion and pro-life issues. And I think what you're going to see over the next few years is Republicans moving more towards those talking points. And yes, of course, there are those supporters who are very conservative on this issue. But I would also say that if you're comfortable getting some of the Republican policies that maybe will start moving a little bit more progressively rather than the Democrats who are way more liberal on this issue, I think that those voters are still going to stay with the Republicans.
Well, I do wonder as well, and this isn't specific to the abortion issue, but if we are allowing, which perhaps we should, allowing candidates to change their tune on various issues. Perhaps it's abortion for Donald Trump and JD Vance. But of course, they've been criticizing Kamala Harris on a number of flip-flops that she has made based on, as Jeanne was alluding to, what she was campaigning on in 2019 in her short-lived first presidential run versus now, be it on healthcare, be it on fracking, for example, something critically important to the swing state of Pennsylvania. Brittany, are Republicans still going to be able to effectively message that she's a flip-flopper on the issues if they are doing the same?
I mean, I think so. There is always an argument to be made, right? And when it comes to this issue, I mean, I know we're speaking beyond abortion now as well, but she hasn't ran as a presidential candidate in, 5 years at this point. And so you are allowed to evolve your opinions, I think. But Republicans are going to hit on the flip-flop. I'm sure Democrats will hit on the flip-flop. It's whoever is able to penetrate the message to Americans in the best way. They're the ones who are going to be the most successful. I mean, it's a messaging game at the end of the day.
Well, and it's also about where you take that message. Of course, we're going to see both of these candidates and the tickets as a whole crisscrossing the swing states today. Donald Trump going, or not today, but this week in Michigan and Pennsylvania. Harris-Walz will be on a bus tour of Georgia later this week. But Jeanne, there has been reporting over the course of the last few days that Donald Trump's getting ready to rev things up. He is going to be much more active on the campaign trail as he's worried about losing ground to Harris. Is it better or worse for the Harris campaign to see more of Donald Trump, knowing that in a number of appearances recently, he has lost discipline and is focusing more on personal attacks than on policy issues? Does him actually being out there more help Harris or hurt her?
You know, I have always been of the opinion that the more Trump, the better for the Democrats, particularly because he just is so undisciplined. His campaign, most Republicans want him to address the issues. On most issues, he has a very good record that appeals to people. When you talk about the economy, when you talk about immigration, when you talk about crime, most people trust him on those things. And yet he goes to these rallies and he says, do you want me to talk about personal issues or the issues, topical issues? And they scream personal issues, and then he goes on the attack. And so he robs himself of the ability to be disciplined and to take Harris on all those issues that you and Brittany were just talking about, from fracking and energy all the way through to the economy, taxes, and everything else. So I think if he is out there in these big rallies and he is his old undisciplined self, it is better for Harris. By the same token, I was surprised Harris was off the campaign trail after her very good convention. I thought very much like Tim Walz said, you can sleep when you're dead. You've got to be out there when the race is this tight. I guess she was preparing for the debate, but I think she has got to be out there. But for her, it's got to be out there talking to reporters and answering some tough questions. So I think they both have challenges on either side.
Well, yeah, Jeannie, to that point, didn't she say that before the month of August was out, she was going to sit down for one of those big interviews? We don't know of anything on the books yet.
Yeah, nothing we've heard of. I keep hearing it's going to be this week, and everybody, and I'm sure you, Kailey, have bid it on come talk to us. Everybody is asking her to come talk to them. We don't know where she'll be, but I really believe she's got to get out there in a tough interview sooner rather than later.
Yes, again, and I will repeat this every chance I get. Vice President Harris, you have a standing invitation to join us here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Of course, the Republican ticket does as well. We'd love to talk to any of you as we are now just 10 weeks out from the election. So Brittany, to the point Jeannie was just making, going back to Donald Trump being more active on the trail, this idea that he has lacked discipline or perhaps is being very disciplined in his shucking off the advice of his advisors and doing exactly the opposite of what it seems they're telling him to do. If you were on that team, and I know you're no fan of Donald Trump, but you are a Republican strategist, how do they work around the candidate here? What is the best way for the campaign, the enterprise of it, to move forward over the course of the next 10 weeks?
I love how you put that. He is very disciplined at being undisciplined. I've never heard that before. It's brilliant. Yes, and even today we've kind of seen the contradiction or over the weekend, right, where they're trying to push back on like no mics during the breaks on, and he was caught on film saying like, oh, I don't care, like we can have him on, but it doesn't matter to me. I'll do whatever. That is not helpful. I mean, I guess that's all you can keep doing is pushing that messaging and trying to stay in control of like the social media, the truth, the Twitter, those sorts of things. But this is what you have to keep in mind. People love, like what Jeannie said earlier about the personal attacks. They love that stuff. The MAGA base loves that. We have seen him be a little bit more disciplined and stick to the script in the binder. But what you lose in that is his enthusiasm and vigor that you see during the attacks. I mean, it feels like a 5-year-old who has been told by his teacher that he has to speak during the school assembly and he just doesn't want to. So as little time in those long-winded press conferences as possible, trying to take control of the Twitter and, trying to have to shift back to messaging when Trump ultimately, inevitably, doesn't say what he should be saying.
Well, so Jeannie, is that why we're seeing the Harris campaign push for mics live during the debate on September 10th, not follow the rules of the Biden-Trump debate that we saw on June 27th, where their mics were cut off after their time was up? They want his mic on because they're hoping he slips up, right?
Absolutely. I think they would love nothing more than a repeat of the first debate in 2020. I don't know if my heart can take it, but I think that's what they're going for. And to Brittany's point, the juxtaposition here is just incredible. Donald Trump on the teleprompter looks like he is a hostage somewhere, whereas Kamala Harris, they say, can't get her off the teleprompter. So we have two very different candidates. And boy, the Democrats want him on that mic saying anything outrageous they can get him to say for that debate. If there is a debate, I should add.
Well, that at this hour is the big if. Brittany, we'll talk more about this in the next hour when you'll be back with us. But Donald Trump suggesting maybe he's not going to show up on that ABC debate on September 10th. Do you buy it? Is he going to miss that opportunity?
I think he'll be there. I think he's just a showman and he likes to exploit the narrative. And so I think he'll be there, but he's just using this time to sort of, get under people's skin, maybe. Who knows? But he'll be there.
All right. Well, Brittany Martinez, Espina & Company founder and Republican strategist, and Jeanne Zaino, Bloomberg Politics contributor and senior democracy fellow at the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Thank you both. Of course, I'll have much more with both Jeanne and Brittany next hour as we continue to keep our eye on the campaign trail and, of course, on the money as well. As we have told you this hour, Kamala Harris has crossed the $500 million fundraising mark, $540 million to be exact, and her presidential campaign is only 5 weeks old at this point. It's only been 5 weeks since Joe Biden left the race. This is a fast-moving campaign. Something tells me the next 10 weeks are going to move even faster. We're just 70 days out, everyone, from this election. We'll continue to have full coverage of it for you here on Bloomberg. And of course, it's not just our political panel that will help us be covering that. We'll speak next hour to Samara Klar of the University of Arizona. take a specific look at that swing state in the Sun Belt that it does seem Kamala Harris and Tim Walz are targeting more of. And we'll keep an eye on the Middle East as well. In the next hour, I'll be joined by Natasha at the Center for Strategic and International Studies as Israel launched preemptive strikes against Hezbollah in Lebanon over the weekend. So much more is still ahead in the second hour of Balance of Power. Stick with us.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
It does feel like a huge part of the city today is still in recovery mode, trying to catch back up on sleep and recharge after last week's very busy Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Certainly an energetic event, I think it's fair to say, and also one that proved to be quite the boon in terms of the money game for Kamala Harris and affiliated super PACs. $82 million raised last week alone, and that brings their total haul, according to the campaign, to $540 million since Joe Biden dropped out of the race. That, of course, happened just 5 weeks ago. We are talking a frenetic pace of fundraising here that is basically unmatched in modern political history. And the campaign, of course, is ongoing now with just 7 weeks to go until Election Day and 2 weeks until a presidential debate that we think is still on, even though Donald Trump is casting a little bit of doubt on that within the last 24 hours. So here to cover it all for us is Laura Davison. She is Bloomberg politics editor and is here with me in studio on Bloomberg TV and radio. So if we could just begin with the money, because of course that is crucially important in a race that is probably going to turn out to be very, very expensive. We were talking about, before Joe Biden dropped out of the race, how Donald Trump is actually the one that was turning out to have the bigger cash advantage. Kamala Harris has been able to flip that script in a very short period of time. The question is, can this keep going, or is she about to tap everything she was going to tap and perhaps tap it too soon?
It's unlikely she's tapped everything she has to tap, particularly as she continues to rise in the polls. Donors like to bet on winners and continue to spend when they see signs that their investment is doing something. But just the number, $540 million, that is a huge figure. Biden's 2020 campaign raised just over $1 billion. So just in the span of 1 month, she's raised more than 50% of what Biden raised in the course of an entire campaign. When there was a lot of money, there was a lot of interest, there was a lot of enthusiasm behind Biden at that time. So it's just a really incredible amount of money that she's brought in the door, and Trump has not been able to match that at all. He's been raising kind of what a normal campaign would, somewhere around $150 million a month, and she's at over $500 million.
Well, and it's not just the actual dollar figures that her campaign is touting; it's people too. This notion that 200,000 volunteers have signed up. How powerful is that? That it's not just the ability to buy ad space on the airwaves, but also get people to knock on doors and to actually do some of the groundworking that might be necessary to turn people out.
That's incredibly helpful with get out the vote type efforts. It also, and this is something they talked a lot about at the convention. If you have people who are enthusiastic and excited, they're talking about it with their friends, they're talking about it with their family, and making sure people have a plan to vote and actually go vote on Election Day. That's the enthusiasm that really kind of helps. Remember, these elections are going to be decided by 10,000 votes in some of the key swing states. So, having, certain communities that make sure that, elderly relatives have a way to get to the polls, that can make a difference.
Well, and as we talk about the swing states, but Harris and Walz will be in Georgia on a bus tour later this week. Donald Trump himself will be kind of crisscrossing. He was in Virginia earlier today. He's going to go to Michigan and Pennsylvania this week as well. And all of the reporting indicates that he's getting ready to ramp things up in a pretty material way, that he's going to be spending more time on the trail, perhaps less time at his properties, be it in Florida or New Jersey. Laura, I would imagine that it's no coincidence that that's coming at a time where Harris is raising so much money and rising, at least from where Joe Biden was in polls. How is Donald Trump planning to counter this? Is it literally just getting out there and going to the states themselves?
That's one of his strategies. He up until about 2 or 3 weeks ago had been doing 1 or 2 events a week. Last week he did something like 7 or 8 events a week. So he's really seeing that having a younger opponent, having both Harris and Walz who are out there on the campaign trail and doing multiple events a day, he's got to be able to match that. There's also some concern sort of among his staff that having him at Mar-a-Lago or at Bedminster, just golfing and stewing too much is also a problem. They want to get him out there in front of voters. Though they're changing their strategy a little bit. They're not doing some of the big rallies that he's done before, partially because those are really expensive. Mm-hmm. They want to keep him on message. So they're doing smaller events, at manufacturing plants, at a sheriff's office to talk about the border, to talk about the economy. That hasn't worked exactly the way they wanted to. He's still been, talking about the personal attacks. Even one rally last week, he polled the crowd and said, hey, do you want me to focus on the personal attacks or not? And, had the crowd cheer for which option they preferred. And the applause was way louder for, continuing on the personal insults.
Yeah, perhaps it's more entertaining. And I take your point about them not wanting to see, or them being his staffers and those advising him, not wanting to see him just hold up in one place stewing for too long. But also, isn't there kind of an argument to be made that the more Trump is out there, the higher likelihood it is that he goes off script, that he loses that discipline? Like, some of the moments may not be so positive that he's generating out there.
That is true. However, he can also be on True Social all day and night, making some of those same things. So even one of the remarks that got the most pickup over the weekend was him talking about how he's going to be a champion for women's reproductive rights.
Yes.
If you're reading that, you might think, oh, this sounds like a Democrat. No, this is Donald Trump, who is now deciding he wants to pivot his messaging on abortion. This is both, of course, outraging Democrats who say, wait, this is our issue. This, Donald Trump doesn't support this, as well as allies saying, hey, I thought this was the pro-life Republican Party. What happened to that?
Well, and JD Vance on Meet the Press on Sunday suggested that Donald Trump would not sign into law a federal ban on abortion, despite what Donald Trump said he would do when he was actually president back in 2018. Elizabeth Warren later came on the program and said women don't trust Trump and Vance on that issue effectively. But JD Vance did sit down for that interview. Kamala Harris, as the Trump and Vance ticket will be very quick to point out, has not yet done so. She said she would do it by the month of August being over. This is the last week of August, Laura. Do we have any idea when this is going to happen?
We have not had any indication that this is going to happen. She's also said she sit down with the National Association of Black Journalists. That's another group that, Trump made a lot of headlines and, when he went in front of them. So the time is sort of now for her to, schedule something to show, hey, look, I can have these unscripted moments. It's also might behoove her because she's got this debate, allegedly, on September 10th. We'll see if it happens. There's been a little bit of back and forth between the camps today on whether this will actually come to fruition, but it's a good test, having to go out there and get pressured on what may be some weak points for the campaign.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because Donald Trump, of course, appeared to be watching ABC News yesterday, didn't necessarily like what he saw. He was on True Social suggesting, why would I debate on this network? Then we understood that there was a bit of an issue happening between the two camps as to whether or not the microphone should be hot the whole time or cut off after your time was up, as we saw on June 27th when Biden and Trump debated. Are these real sticking points that realistically could result in this debate not happening, though, Laura? Is either candidate going to be willing to give up the opportunity to address each other and the American people on stage 2 weeks from now?
It's highly unclear if this debate is going to happen. Harris seems more committed to it. And in fact, she wants Trump's mic to be unmuted throughout the entire time. Remember, the Biden camp wanted the exact opposite. They wanted the mics to be muted. Now it's Trump's side that wants them to be muted. So it's a little bit, both sides are kind of flip-flopping back on the rules. It seems like Trump personally is the one who is more concerned about being out there. He's, said he wouldn't debate. Then he said he wanted to debate. Now he's saying he won't debate. We'll see. Harris has said she's going to show up on September 10th, no matter what. We'll see. That's just 2 weeks away.
It is indeed. So we'll see indeed. Laura Davison, who, of course, is an editor on politics for us here at Bloomberg, thank you so much for joining me. And an issue that likely would come up in the debate and came up at the Democratic National Convention as well, of the ongoing war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. Harris did make reference to that in her acceptance speech, as she said that she and Biden are working toward a ceasefire deal, but also said that ultimately what she wants to see is freedom and security and self-determination for the Palestinian people. That was a phrase or a sentence that got loud roars and applause from the crowd gathered there in Chicago. I would point out as well that there were not as disruptive protests in Chicago, pro-Palestinian protesters, as some feared going into it. All that said, things continue in the Middle East to catch our attention, including this weekend, Israel launching what it described as a preemptive strike against Hezbollah targets in southern Lebanon. This is, of course, as we were all waiting for retaliation from both Hezbollah and potentially Iran itself for the assassinations of a Hezbollah commander and Hamas's political leader in Tehran last month. So for more on this, we turn to Natasha Hall. She is a senior fellow with the Middle East program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Natasha, it's a lot to discuss, but if we could first focus on the strikes Israel conducted over the weekend. They described them as preemptive, but were they also escalatory?
That's a great question. I mean, what Israel ended up saying was that these were preemptive strikes, that they had gotten word or they had gotten intelligence that Hezbollah was about to launch a major attack, and that this preemptive strike preempted this attack from Hezbollah, which would have launched thousands of rockets into Israel. We still saw attacks from Hezbollah, hundreds of rockets and drones towards Israel, and they were meant to target a military base within Israel itself, at least according to Hezbollah sources. And so there was a very, very heightened escalation in the early morning hours of Sunday. But it's unclear if this was escalatory or not. But military analysts are saying that this was essentially effective in terms of deterrence.
Okay, so if it was effective deterrence, is it effective at deterring more than just what was understood to be an imminent strike by Israeli intelligence? And by that, I mean, if they were specifically going after Hezbollah missile launchers, did it take out enough capability that Hezbollah poses less of a threat to Israel now if it decides it wants to try retaliation again?
Well, I mean, Hezbollah is the best armed non-state actor, perhaps in the world. So it has hundreds of thousands of drones and rockets. So this doesn't necessarily wipe out their capabilities, and they've been able to rebuild their capabilities quite quickly with the support of Iran. So I wouldn't say that this is a long-term deterrent strategy, but what it was a way for both Israel and Hezbollah to say that they did something in the aftermath of the assassination of Hezbollah leader Fouad Shukr late last month, and also Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran. That said, Iran still has not conducted its retaliatory strike for that assassination the way that they had promised to. So it's unclear if this is peace for the long run or if this is just a momentary pause. At the moment, most people believe it could be just a momentary pause, but at least long enough for people to go back to their normal lives.
Well, and so this notion about Iran potentially deciding to take retaliatory measures itself, when we saw Iran launch the attempted strikes on Israel back in April, the drones and the missiles that were largely intercepted, everybody said, well, Iran did kind of telegraph what it was going to do in sending those slow drones first. So there was warning that it was coming. Now Israeli intelligence picked up that Hezbollah was getting ready to strike and tried to counteract that before it even could happen. Does that suggest that Iran potentially is going to trying to avoid that same ending, try to actually land a blow against Israel this time?
It's possible. I mean, it would make them extremely vulnerable to a wide-scale attack by Israel. We now have 2 U.S. carrier strike groups in the Middle East at the moment, but it's difficult to remain on high alert for a very long time. And so it's probably Iran's strategy to wait this out a little bit until that high alert kind of diminishes. And that's an effective strategy as well, because if they can connect it to the failure of ceasefire talks, which we haven't discussed yet, but ceasefire talks remain ongoing, but without any kind of conclusion. Yeah. And in fact, there's been an escalation in Gaza of Israeli attacks there. So Iran could effectively point to that failure and the assassination attempt in the weeks ahead. When it goes ahead with some kind of retaliatory strike. But it needs to be careful because it does not have the competitive edge the way that Israel does.
Well, Natasha, I do want to talk about those ceasefire talks, especially given the description we got on the progress from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor who spoke in Canada over this weekend. Take a listen.
It is incumbent on all parties in the region to work towards de-escalation and stability. And so we are feverishly working in Cairo as we speak with our team and the teams of the other mediators, as well as with the Israelis, to get to a ceasefire and hostage deal.
Natasha, does it feel to you like all of this feverish work is going somewhere?
It seems like there's feverish work to prevent a regional escalation, and there's certainly diplomats that are working on the ground nonstop on these talks. But we've been talking about the same sticking points in these ceasefire negotiations for months now. And some of that is the control of the Philadelphia corridor, which lands between Gaza and Egypt, and the Netzarim corridor, which is sort of halfway between the Gaza Strip. But in the meantime, Israel has ordered an evacuation of areas previously described as humanitarian areas. And this is after people have been displaced dozens and dozens of times. And we have reports of polio breaking out in Gaza. So this feverish diplomacy that we've been hearing about for months seems to be delayed. Hamas has left Cairo, where the negotiations were happening, saying that they resented the fact that Israel was trying to change the stipulations of previous potential agreements in July. So it remains to be seen. I think Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, also has to deal with multiple constituents, those on the far right who refuse any kind of ceasefire negotiations, and the rest of the country, which frankly wants a pause to this fighting.
And Natasha, we just have a minute left, but I do wonder about the role of the U.S. here and whether it continually is getting ahead of itself. Joe Biden, at the end of May, outlined this multi-step plan, saying that this was the agreement and parties just needed to sign off. It obviously didn't happen. They're still working on the same framework now. Then Antony Blinken last week suggested Israel has agreed to this, making it seem like the finish line was in sight, and yet it very clearly is not. Does the U.S. need to stop trying to paint this as more done than it is in public?
I think their strategy has been trying to push Netanyahu by going public with these kinds of agreements and make it seem essentially inevitable that there's a ceasefire agreement in place. And of course, there's political reasons for this as well, where we have a presidential election very soon. And so getting a ceasefire agreement or acting like a ceasefire agreement is imminent is in their political interests. But it remains to be seen if there isn't actual sort of military pressure put on Israel by the United States, if Israel would actually agree to this. Netanyahu has a lot of political considerations, which would potentially prevent him from doing so. And so if there isn't more pressure applied there, it remains to be seen if there will be any kind of substantive ceasefire agreement in the upcoming weeks.
All right, Natasha, thanks as always for joining us. Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow with the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Always appreciate your insight. Thank you for joining us right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
It's a week in which we will see the presidential tickets crisscrossing a number of the swing states that ultimately could decide the outcome of this election. Donald Trump and JD Vance will be in Michigan and Pennsylvania this week, while Kamala Harris and Tim Walz later on this week will be in Georgia doing a bus tour of the state. Interesting to see the Harris-Walz ticket focusing their time in the week after the Democratic National Convention in the Sun Belt. Georgia, of course, is part of that, as are other states, including North Carolina and Arizona, where Harris is polling better than Joe Biden was when he left the race just 5 weeks ago. So it's to the Sun Belt we go now. Samara Klar is with me. She is a professor of public policy and government at the University of Arizona School of Government and Public Policy. Samara, it's always great to have you. As we look specifically at Arizona, and of course, we look back to the New York Times Siena poll that came out last weekend that showed Harris at 50 and Trump at 45. Do you buy that? Do you buy that something has fundamentally changed to put a state that seemed, frankly, out of play for Joe Biden in play and potentially looking like Kamala Harris could lock it up?
Yeah, I mean, sure, I absolutely buy it. Before there was the switch to Harris, I don't think we should overstate how dramatic this change has been. Biden did win Arizona in 2020, of course. Previous to him stepping aside, he was down in the polls, but typically by about 5 percentage points. So it wasn't landslide blowout polling in Trump's favor. And I would say the same thing now. Trump is still ahead in Arizona in some polls. The poll you cite has Harris ahead by about 4 or so percentage points, so not quite outside the margin of error. So, we started off with a really tight race in Arizona, and what we have today is a really tight race in Arizona.
Well, that's fair. And I wonder about the demographics who ultimately will decide that race one way or another. While I was in Chicago last week, Samara, we spoke with the head of the Hispanic Federation, others who look specifically at the Latino vote as well, who have suggested that they have seen a serious increase in enthusiasm, or at least interest in this race, since Harris became the nominee instead of Joe Biden. Is it the Latino vote that will matter most in Arizona, or is it another group we should be watching more carefully?
The Latino vote should not be, it cannot be overstated in Arizona. We have a large and growing proportion of our electorate who are Latino. We have a lot of young voters voting for the first time. So Latino voters matter. Youth vote matters. The urbanization of Arizona, where we have voters moving from rural areas into urban areas and voting for the first time. We, of course, have a lot of domestic migration into Arizona. So there's a lot of important groups out here in Arizona, and any one of them could make the difference because our electoral outcomes here are so razor thin. Latinos in Arizona do typically support Democrats at higher rates, about 2-1, but there's a lot of political diversity. I always say Latinos are not a monolithic voting bloc by any stretch of the imagination, and both parties should and can make a concerted appeal for their support.
Well, certainly. And as you talk about first-time voters within that group, the Harris campaign is also pointing to first-time donors that have made contributions to their campaign in just the 5 weeks since it launched, since Joe Biden dropped out of the race. They say they've raised $540 million in total between the campaign and affiliated super PACs. They say 1/3 of that are first-time donors. 2/3 of the total, Samara, are women. And I wonder, as we consider demographic groups here, how you are watching women in particular in Arizona and frankly elsewhere.
Harris is the beneficiary of a widening gender gap in Arizona and across the country, where women are supporting Harris at much higher rates than they appeared to have been supporting Joe Biden. And that is especially true among the youngest generations, and the 18 to 29-year-olds voting for the first time, donating for the first time. Those women are showing really unprecedented levels of support for a Democratic nominee at this point in the race. So I think, a lot of that attracts with what we're seeing in the polls, with young women coming out and supporting Harris at vastly higher levels than they had been supporting Joe Biden.
Well, and of course, women's rights, reproductive rights specifically, was a big focus of conversation on the stage and elsewhere in Chicago last week at the DNC. Kamala Harris specifically talked about reproductive rights. At one point in her acceptance speech, talked about what Republicans and Donald Trump want to do on abortion and called them simply out of their minds. And that was a direct quote, Samara. But it does seem that the Republican ticket is trying to reshape, at least, its stance on abortion or message it differently, including the vice presidential nominee, Senator JD Vance, who sat down for an interview on Meet the Press this weekend and was asked whether or not Donald Trump would sign a federal abortion ban into law. This was his answer.
I can absolutely commit that, Kristen, and Donald Trump has been as clear about that as possible. I think it's important to step back and say, what has Donald Trump actually said on the abortion question, and how is it different from what Kamala Harris and the Democrats have said? Donald Trump wants to end this culture war over this particular topic. If California wants to have a different abortion policy from Ohio, then Ohio has to respect California and California has to respect Ohio. Donald Trump's view is that we want the individual states and their individual cultures and their unique political sensibilities to make these decisions.
And I should be clear, what he said he could commit to was Donald Trump not signing a federal abortion ban, Samara, despite the fact that when Trump was president back in 2018, he was pushing the Senate to pass a 20-week ban on abortion, get it to his desk so that he could sign it. Are American voters going to buy that he thinks differently now in a post-Roe world?
Well, this has been a really big pivot for a lot of Republican candidates. What we're seeing is Americans generally do not favor abortion bans, and support for reproductive rights has been really high even in red states. So Republican candidates, from Donald Trump down to here in Arizona, Carrie Lake, Juan Ciscomani, they've all been trying to figure out how they can amend their views, change their views, however you want to think about it, to better suit the American people. It seems where Republicans have landed is on sort of leaving it to the people to decide, trying to step away from it altogether. And here in Arizona, we do have abortion on the ballot in November, and it's going to be a huge motivator for a lot of pro-choice voters who say that abortion is more important to them than what we typically see pro-life voters saying. So to restate that, pro-choice voters say abortion is more important than pro-life voters do. So it's more of a mobilizing issue that could help Kamala Harris in Arizona and in other states across the country.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you raised that point, Samara, because, of course, since Roe was overturned, since the Dobbs decision, we have seen abortion literally on the ballot in a number of states, and voters overwhelmingly in each of those instances have voted to protect abortion rights and have done so in, frankly, high numbers. So as you were alluding to before, the fact that things are always really, really close in Arizona, these are always very tight races, is the fact that abortion is also going to be on that ballot in addition to the senatorial candidates, to the presidential candidates. Could that potentially be the thing that makes or breaks who wins?
Absolutely. I mean, we have abortion on the ballot. That's going to be very mobilizing and will probably help not only Kamala Harris, but down ballot Democrats as well. We also have an immigration measure on the ballot, which provides the state of Arizona with more power to enforce immigration here at the state level. That could potentially help Republican candidates. And so we are seeing this sort of tension between a ballot measure that favors the Democrats and a ballot measure that favors the Republicans. We'll see how these two ballot measures eventually balance out. But I mean, anything within a state like this where things are so close, it's hard for me to say that there's anything that couldn't make a difference.
Well, so I'd like to ask you about something that could make a difference, or really two things, and which one of them might matter the most. We have been talking at length here today about the fundraising figures from the Harris campaign, $540 million raised in the 5 weeks since Joe Biden dropped out, but also this notion that the campaign says it's not just about the money they've raised, it's about the people they have signed up to volunteer, more than 200,000 of them that could potentially be out there knocking on doors, working the ground game. Samara, how important will that be in a state like Arizona? Not just buying time on the airwaves, but also having people show up to talk to Arizonans in person.
Well, you know, over a third of Arizonans identify as independent and tell pollsters that they are uncommitted to either party. Now, typically independents do favor one party over the other, but getting these groups mobilized and getting them, you know, registered and ready to vote is you know, it's essential. And the fact that there's such a big ground campaign going on right now in Arizona is going to be really, really essential. I mean, I am expecting a lot of knocks on my door and a lot of text messages and a lot of phone calls, and I think everybody in Arizona is going to experience that.
I also want to ask you, Samara, something that happened in Arizona last week, which was RFK Jr. suspending his presidential campaign and then endorsing Donald Trump and joining him on stage in Arizona. What difference do you think that actually makes there, or in any other state for that matter? Were you considering RFK Jr. as a consequential factor in the outcome of this race?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to wait to see how the polls play out this week. I have a poll going out to Arizonans this week as well. Support for RFK had dipped really low. I mean, it was hovering around 5% by the time he dropped out. So we're not talking about a lot of voters here. And there is a lot of speculation as to what these voters are going to do. They're not uniformly leaning toward Trump. They do favor Trump over Harris, but just slightly so. So it's hard to know whether this is going to make a difference. But, you know, as I just said, anything could. And we're going to see what the numbers say over the next, you know, week or two as these voters decide whether they'll participate at all or who it is that they're going to give their vote to.
Well, and of course, before they ultimately decide, they will have potentially chances to hear from both of these candidates. September 10th on ABC. 2 weeks from tomorrow, Samara, is scheduled to be the first presidential debate between Trump and Harris, though Donald Trump is maybe throwing into question whether he wants it to be on ABC, whether or not mics will be hot the whole time, is an outstanding issue, it seems, between these two campaigns. But how consequential will that moment be to voters in these swing states, including Arizona, of course, but elsewhere, in deciding who they're going to cast a ballot for? Can either candidate afford to give up that opportunity?
I mean, listen, I was always one of the many political scientists who'd say, you know, debates don't all matter all that much, but look what happened after that Biden-Trump debate. So debates matter, it turns out. And, you know, I think Kamala Harris has a bit of a lead right now in terms of momentum and just the trends in her favor. So the debate's going to matter, especially for Trump. He's going to kind of have to stop her in her tracks a little bit, try to reverse that momentum. And so I think it will be consequential when it comes to determining, you know, the trends going forward. Harris has been on an upward trajectory ever since she announced her candidacy. The debate could be a good opportunity for Trump to sort of stop those trends and regain that momentum.
All right, Samara, always great to have you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Thank you so much for joining me. Samara Klar, of course, of the University of Arizona. We appreciate your time as we focus on the southwest part of the United States. But we also have a message today for those in the Northeast. In New England specifically, we have some news for our Bloomberg radio audience. Starting on September 3rd, you can listen to Bloomberg Radio in and around Boston on our new signal, 92.9 FM. It's your new source for business news from the financial center of New England. Again, Bloomberg Radio is moving to 92.9 FM at noon, the day after Labor Day.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.